Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Content warning for this episode, tales of elder abuse.
In the 1980s and 1990s, a series of murders were carried out which eventually became known as the Foxglove murders in San Francisco. In these cases, a single crime family was befriending and even marrying elderly people to earn their trust, and then poison them and steal their money. Because of prejudices against both the perpetrators and the victims, the police did nothing for years, and interest in the case was kept alive by the victims' families and a stubborn gumshoe. The main source for this episode is Hasten to the Grave by Jack Olson, which is a very biased book, as the subtitle itself has a slur in it, if you go look up the book. And Olson's descriptions of this crime family are extremely cringy, dated, and just anti-Zygon overall in most parts, which is to say that it's anti-Roma, and it's so bad that I don't even know if I can justifiably say like it's an interesting read. Like, you know, I'm citing it
had
because
to get in and get out.
Yeah, it did have all of the things that happened, but the descriptions are like it's kind of detective pulp noir type shit, but yeah, it's
unnecessarily.
Yeah. Hopefully this episode gives you everything you need from this book. And the author was just like infatuated with the private investigator. She could do no wrong, according to him.
Oh.
And like she seems like a very nice woman. She does, but like the bias there was just like it was a lot. It was a lot to read, especially as a woman. So that PI was a woman by the name of Faron, and Faron stumbled into investigative work in 1982 after she was assaulted and mugged of her wallet, and then within 36 hours also lost her houseboat when a storm hit Sausalito.
Shit.
Yeah, not a good time for her.
No, that's a lot to happen in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
Devastating.
So she had nothing, and she knew she would be living on the streets if she couldn't figure something out. So she had to prove that the houseboat was unfit for water when she bought it. And so Faron talked to a neighbor in the harbor to get some information and learned that the previous tenant departed from the houseboat to join the Breatharian cult in Texas.
Oh, I haven't heard of them.
I know, right? We need to look into them.
I know. I haven't heard of these people.
So in the 1980s, she tracks down this cultist in Texas from California. Only took 2 days to find him, got him to sign an affidavit attesting to the poor shape of the boat, and then got her $26,000 in insurance and got her life back on track.
Oh, okay.
I know.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Let's go, Faye.
So a lawyer named Ken Chan took notice of that. He was involved in some part of this, and he noticed her and was impressed by this. And so he offered her a stack of uncollected judgments and 50% commission.
Okay.
And she'd never worked as a PI. I don't recall what her job was before this, but she was able to track down 3 of these targets in a week just by working out of a phone booth.
Damn.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
And so her PI work was more like, they called her a skip tracer. I don't think she was a bounty hunter, but she like would help you find like your long lost family member or whatever. And she was so good at it that at one point someone remarked to her,
Faye, you chase down people like a rat dog chases rats.
And this earned her the moniker Rat Dog Dick, since Dick is another word for PI.
Yes.
And it got her more clients. It got her a little bit more respect putting an ad out there because nobody wants to hire a PI named Faye, right? That's obviously a woman.
Mm-hmm.
But there were still people who were real shitty when she said Rat Dog Dick Detective Agency and it was a woman. They were like, what the fuck? And she's like, come on. And then women hated it. Women were like, you shouldn't call yourself a dick. And she's like, I am a dick.
But she is, yeah.
And so she was good at it. Investigation didn't pay the bills necessarily. She was in a lot of debt, but she was quite good at it. So, in 1992, Rat Dog Dick gets a call from Chan about a case that was in his words, no big deal.
Okay.
But it is the contents of this episode.
So it is a very big deal.
The client was an 82-year-old Russian woman named Hope Victoria Beasley, who was born Nadia Malashev. Beasley believed she was being swindled out of thousands of dollars by a former handyman on her $500,000 home. This is in 1992, and so that would be $1.1 million in today's money. But since it's real estate, it's probably astronomically higher than that.
Even more, yeah.
So this handyman was a man named Danny Taney, and he wasn't sought out by Beasley when he was hired as a handyman, but he actually came up to her like when she was outside or something, or knocked on her door. And he offered to help with housework, gardening, things like that. And so she says, yeah, sure, why not? You seem able-bodied and willing. And then, time passes, and Teeny asks if he can rent out Beasley's empty garage for his Corvette. And she says, well, it's empty, so sure, why not?
Sure.
Then he asked if he could just stay in the house, since Beasley had 5 empty bedrooms. I know, right?
Let me just scooch in on over here.
Yeah. And she says yes, because she does have 5 empty bedrooms, and she has been doing the landlord thing for a bit. I don't know if she was doing the landlady thing, I guess, during this time, but she had done it before. She has experience, and she says yes. And then Teeny suggested that he make his tenancy completely above board, like she was somehow going under the table or something. He was like, no, let's make this totally legal and have us both sign a joint tenancy agreement, which would actually earn Beasley, he said, $75,000, or in today's money, $170,000. Like, easy landlord money, right? Everything was signed in front of a notary. Everything seemed totally legal and normal. But then after signing it, rather than moving in or, changing anything, because he was already living there,
right,
Teeny disappeared for like 2 or 3 years.
Huh.
In the meantime, Beasley's taxes raised annually due to the joint tenancy agreement, but she couldn't she couldn't get a hold of Danny to sort it out. And then she started receiving phone calls in the middle of the night, like 7 or 8 every night, asking if she was alive or just hanging up.
Ugh.
As it turned out, joint tenancy in California means joint ownership, making Teeny the legal owner of Beasley's house upon her death.
So he's just sitting around waiting for her to die.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
My God.
And then, as things happen, of course, Beasley fell, broke her hip, and became bedridden. She was all alone and vulnerable in this huge house that someone somewhere was waiting for her to die in. And so this is when she contacted Chan, who filed the decision for Beasley that Teeny fought. They finally found him, and he fights it. And to bring him in for the battle, to go get this guy and bring him back to San Francisco so that he'll face Beasley, that's where Chan calls Rat Dog Dick. So that's where Faron comes in. But Faron was having a hard time tracking down Danny Teeny, as good as she was at what she did. Despite having a fairly uncommon surname, T-E-N-E, it's not that, I haven't heard of any.
It's not that common, no.
Yeah. Few hits for it came up in the phone book or the Social Security Administration's database. The hits she did get looked like repeats or errors, some of them mixed with another surname, Bimbo, so she had a lot of Teeny, Bimbo people coming up. When she looked for Teeny and Bimbo together or apart, she found that some names had 2 or 3 Social Security numbers associated with them.
Oh.
And some of these numbers belonged to dead people, while others didn't. So it's like, what is going on with the Social Security Administration? Yeah. There were restraining orders she found, arrest records, for people with this Teeny Bimbo name, but nothing that led anywhere useful, and nothing for Danny Teeny. And when Rat Dog explained this to Chan, he told her, oh, that's not unusual. And then he described the Teeny Bimbos with a slur starting with G and rhyming with tipsy. So let's talk about that particular slur instead of prejudices, because it is a big part of this story, unfortunately, anywhere that you will read about this fucking story.
Oh, really?
Yes. Yeah. They're like, they did it because they were these kind of people. And it's like, we're just going to paint
Oh.
people with a broad brush again? Is this
Yeah.
what we're doing? So pretty much everything you know about this group of people is wrong because they've been discriminated against, persecuted, and lied about for ages. Like, you either get the description that they're all like Esmeralda in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or you get people who, when you're like, oh, I'm going to Europe, I'm going to wherever, they're like, oh, watch out for these people. They'll pick your pockets. And it's like,
right.
I don't know that they'll pick my pockets because they are a group of people, though. Like,
No.
they're
Like,
just hard up, right?
yeah.
And the slur that I'm not going to say, but that you may recognize these traveler people by, originates from the ignorant belief that they came from Egypt. When in reality, the Roma or Romani people are the descendants of a single Indian population that came from Asia 1,500 years ago and spread across Europe through the Balkans. The 11 million Romas in Europe represent the largest minority group on the continent, and they are the poorest, most unemployed, shortest lived, most welfare dependent, and most segregated because of all of these negative stereotypes that we have against them.
That have just perpetuated since I don't even know how long. Like,
yeah, since they got to Europe, really. I mean, when they first, made their trek and they came into Europe, they were seen as foreigners because they were non-Christian and non-white. And it's so bad. It's gotten a little bit better with laws, but almost every country in the EU has at some point instituted anti-Roma laws, like very specific anti-Roma laws, including in the 16th century when England passed a law that allowed the imprisonment, execution, or exile of anyone perceived to be Roma.
Oh my God.
And during World War II, a quarter of the Roma population in Europe was exterminated by the Nazis during the Perajmos, or the Roma Holocaust.
Fucking tragic.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of negative stuff associated with them, but it's just constantly reinforced,
Mm-hmm.
And these issues aren't even necessarily issues of the past. When I went on my honeymoon 7 years ago, I had people telling me, watch out for these people. And, right now, in the last couple of years, far-right populism in Europe has led to an increase in hate crimes and attacks against Roma individuals and communities. For an accurate representation of Roma cultures and history, I recommend checking out the creator Florian on Instagram, TikTok. They're kind of just wherever, so I would go find them. They talk about the history and cultures of the Roma people, so I think that is a good place to start re-educating yourself on that. Unfortunately, the perpetrators in this story are Roma, and it's not because they are Roma.
No, it's not because they are Roma. It's because they were criminals.
It's because they were criminals. They were a crime family. You don't look at the mafia and say all Italians are criminals.
Exactly.
So, so we're looking at a Roma crime family. But it's not a reflection on their ethnicity.
There's crime families of all cultures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Faron is looking for a Roma man. She knows that now. And she's looking for him with all of these prejudices in mind. And she was fairly open about telling that to Jack Olson. And he always gives her the credit that, like, she gave people the benefit of the doubt. And she saw them kind of as the Esmeralda type. Like, I don't know, like his mental gymnastics that he does to make Faron out to be this, like, can do no wrong side kind of person was just... And this is primarily where it was, that she was just so nice to these Roma people,
Right. When she's harboring all of the same
prejudices,
that everyone else was,
Yeah. So she's looking for Danny Teeny, and then Beasley suddenly dies a week after Faron is brought onto the case. The medical examiner calls it natural causes, and Beasley is survived only by a son who lives in Australia that she hasn't seen for years. And so her case can continue on so that Teeny doesn't get to cash out on his crime. So, like, Chan and Faron, they're gonna keep going with it so that he can't get any of the money. But Beasley was the only witness to the events, so her death is going to make it harder for Chan and Faron to continue the case on behalf of her estate.
Significantly harder, I'm sure.
Yes. And Faron essentially works on this case pro bono, which is another thing where Jack Olson is like, she was just a saint. And it's like, it's very cool that she did this case pro bono, but also, she's just a lady. Come on.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the house did officially become Danny Taney's, who crawled out of the woodwork and had his lawyer change the locks because he was legally the owner of the house.
Ugh.
But Faron was determined that if there was anything in the house that she was not going to let him get it. He wasn't going to pawn Beasley's stuff or anything like that if she could help it. So she continues to search through court records, and this leads her to documents on a legal battle regarding an eviction between Graziana Gondolfi and Mary Steiner Teeny. And Gondolfi couldn't discuss her own legal issues around this eviction because of the settlement agreement that she came to with Mary Teeny. But she did tell Faron that Mary Teeny was Danny Teeny's mother.
Okay.
And she explained how she came to make their very unpleasant acquaintance. Gondolfi moved to her San Francisco apartment in the mid-70s, and it was run by a Russian man named Konstantin Levatzin. And although Gandolfi was in her 20s and Levatzin was in his 80s when they met, they actually became really good friends, and she described him as the grandfather she never had.
Okay.
They talked often. She would help him carry his groceries, and she would sometimes pick up sweets for him and drive him to church on Sundays. Gandolfi was a polyglot but didn't know any Russian, so he would teach her little words and phrases. And she was actually one of the few people in this whole building that didn't speak Russian, and also probably one of the youngest tenants. The others included 80-something Sonia Ellis, 90-year-old retired nurse Anna Adamosov, and the 80-something artist Tamara Baruch-Sapolo and her son, who is an inventor named Jim, and he was a little closer to Gandolfi's age. In March of 1986, Levatzin fell and broke his hip. When Gandolfi visited him in the hospital and asked if there was anything he needed help with, he told her not to worry about anything because he'd taken care of the mail and the rent, and he'd handed the keys over to a woman whose name he wasn't sure he knew, but he'd met her just a couple days before he broke his hip. And Gandolfi's obviously like, what the fuck? You just met this woman and now you're handing over rent and everything to her?
And, yeah.
Yeah. And then when Levatzin returned home a few days later, this mystery woman announced she had power of attorney for the landlord and would now be writing his checks.
What?
And then things only got worse from there. Gandolfi was completely cut off from her old friend. Months went by when no one would answer the door when she knocked. And when she would just try it to see if she could walk in, it was locked. She tried to call and found that his old number didn't work and that his new number wasn't listed in the phone book. His newspaper delivery stopped, and she's getting very worried. Does he live there anymore? Is he alive anymore? So she goes back, pounding on the door to get someone to open it. And when it does open, the mystery woman told her that she was Mary Steiner, Levatzin's nurse, and he was tired and couldn't see anyone. Steiner soon moved her 3 sons into the apartment, the oldest of which was Danny Teeny, so this is how Gandolfi meets him.
Okay.
And although Steiner never let anyone into the apartment to visit Levatzin, he was actually still there.
Okay, so he was alive.
He was alive. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so one night Gandolfi heard Levatzin crying out for help from one of the teenies. He was just shouting their names and saying, "Help, you've got to help me." So she runs into the apartment and finds him alone, lying in bed in his own feces with a carton of milk and a can of ravioli.
Oh my God.
And he tells her that the teenies set out food for him every day or two and only replaced it when it was gone. And so she's very concerned about his health, about the sanitation, about if he's getting quality food. Right. And the man is in his 90s and is recovering from a hip fracture.
Yeah. Broken bones at that age are a big deal.
Yeah, especially your hip. Especially your hip. On top of that, when she asked what the fuck was going on with Steiner and the situation with the tenants, because everybody's kind of confused about who's in charge and they're threatening to raise rents and stuff.
Okay, Miss Nurse, ma'am, who the fuck are you? Excuse the hell out of me.
Right. So she asks him what is going on with this, and Levatzin tells her, don't worry about it. A woman named Marushka is the manager now. But Marushka may have been Mary. It's kind of unclear if there was this additional woman who was the manager.
Gotcha.
And it didn't seem like Litvitsin was paying anybody regularly, so something very, very weird is going on. He showed Gandolfi 2 canceled checks that he made out to a Sal Lamance for $25,000 each, and he explained that this Sal person was Danny Teeny. And of course, Gandolfi's like, what are you talking about? But so he makes out these checks and say that the money was payment to them, to these teenies, for getting him out of the hospital because they were so kind to get him out of the hospital and bring him home, and they didn't have a car, so this money is for a car.
Okay.
But he was having issues. There was 2 of them because he was having issues with the checks getting cashed. And really, he was just being had. He lost $50,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so unfortunate.
Yeah. So Faron recognized, when she's talking to Gandolfi, she actually recognizes the name Sal Lamance and knew that Danny Teeny's gold Corvette was registered under the name Sal Lamance. So he bought a gold Corvette with this money he got from Litvitsin. Seems to be the case. Gandolfi continues her story and says that a few months after that whole interaction, Litvitsin was back in the hospital and doctors were telling Steiner that he needed a much higher level of care than she was giving him.
Not a carton of milk and a can of raviolis.
Yeah, like you don't need to be a physician to figure that one out.
No.
And they were actually saying that Litvitsin would probably die from these conditions unless he was put into a facility where he was getting better care and exercise. But Steiner refused to spend any money on Litvitsin's care. So instead, she bought a hospital bed for his apartment and then just left him in the bed. When Gandolfi regained entry into his apartment months later, she found him nearly non-responsive. Steiner was there and was like, what are you doing here? And there's this whole, confrontation. And she calls the cops on Gandolfi and claims that she was... She claims that she was touching the old man inappropriately.
Oh, my God.
And so the cops come, they remove Gandolfi from the apartment, but they don't buy Steiner's story that this is what happened. But either way, they still don't file a report or anything. They're just like, ladies, stop.
Yeah.
And they don't do anything. They don't help Litvitsin. They don't do anything. And Gandolfi couldn't get anyone else to care about this old man. She tried calling the mayor. She tried calling Litvitsin's surviving nephew. She tried talking to the people at his church where he used to go every Sunday. But no one would help.
Ugh.
Then Mary Steiner raised the rent from $265 a month to an illegal, it was illegal to raise it this much in San Francisco, $360.
Holy shit.
Yeah. Gandolfi contacted the rent board to ask how she even had the authority to do that. She's just this weird nurse, right? And that's when she learns that Litvitsin signed a joint tenancy agreement with Steiner in April, just after he'd returned from the hospital.
No.
Yes. Litvitsin continues to get worse. He was eventually transferred to a convalescent home and died there in December of 1989. No autopsy was performed, but his death certificate declared that the cause of death was a stroke. Mary Steiner was now the sole owner of the building and raised rent that used to be $265 because this is 1989 or 1990.
Right.
She raised it to $1,150 a month.
That's insane.
That's equivalent to like $2,900 a month, like nowadays.
Yeah, that's insane.
Yeah. And so even though Litvitsin had a surviving nephew, he does have surviving family. This nephew ended up only getting a split deal on the estate with Steiner because of the joint tenancy. And she took nearly all of Litvitsin's $2 million in 1980s money in cash and assets.
Holy shit.
She forced out almost all of the previous tenants by either raising their rent, providing them with such poor maintenance that they left on their own, basically, committing psychological warfare on them.
Oh my God.
Giving them eviction notices. And all of these people, as I said before, they were kind of elderly people.
Yeah.
They found this apartment, they'd lived there forever, and they were probably kind of expecting to just die there.
Yeah. That's what it seemed like. It was It was like a place that was safe for the elderly
Right,
that wasn't a nursing home.
right,
Like if they were independent enough and didn't need that level of care.
right. So they're having to find new places. Gandolfi, for all of her effort that she's trying to do to fight all of this, she earned mutual restraining orders between herself and Steiner and a completely depleted savings account because of the legal battles. So that inventor's son of a tenant that I mentioned earlier, Jim, his name was Jim Egoroth, and he was the first person to give the impression that Steiner may actually have been giving Litvacin medications in her capacity as nurse. So he's the first person that was like, there could have been something going on, a little poisonous. So Egoroff told Faron that when Steiner first started taking care of the landlord, he was dopey and disoriented much of the time. And when Egoroff asked about it, Steiner told him that the man was just on a lot of painkillers to deal with his hip break. Ultimately, however, Egoroff believed that Litvacyn's death was mostly murder by neglect because the man had no teeth towards the end and went unfed for long periods of time and, as I said, was in just horribly unsanitary conditions. Egoroff knew this because he had also made sporadic entry into the apartment to check in on the old man and to find out what was going on. He'd also made calls to the police about elder abuse, but whenever he would call, the teenies would quickly cover up any evidence of what was going on before the cops would arrive, so nothing was done.
This is so sad.
So when I mentioned psychological warfare earlier, I wasn't kidding. I mean, it wasn't war, but like the teenies threatened people, they gaslighted the residents, and there was actually some physical violence.
Oh, Jesus.
And this is alleged. I don't think that anybody was charged for this. So this is alleged. Let's just blanket that statement now.
Alleged.
Yeah. Jim and his mother were some of the last holdouts who managed to stick around and fight the eviction threats. But one day in early 1993, Danny Teeny and his brothers came by and told Mrs. Baruch-Sopoulou that they suspected her gas stove was leaking and they needed to fix it. The men made her very uncomfortable whenever they were around, and Jim wasn't there that day, so she just went into a different room while they were working and wasn't supervising what was going on with the men in her apartment. Around 10 o'clock that night, Jim and his mother had a snack of cottage cheese and cherries, and then an hour later, both suffered severe vomiting, stomach cramps, and diarrhea. Jim ate some bread and drank some milk to settle his stomach, but his mother couldn't keep anything down, and he had to take her to the hospital where she was diagnosed with acute gastroenteritis. So, severe food poisoning. And she never really recovered from this because she was so elderly, and she ended up suffering a stroke in the hospital that left her right side totally paralyzed.
Oh, fuck.
In the spring of 1993, Faron learned that the teeny daughter was also being implicated in a slew of poisonings. This daughter was named Angela Buford, according to documents that she found. Her and her boyfriend George Lama allegedly earned the trust of elderly men by running errands for them and then poisoned them by delivering tainted food. And this is according to George's sister. So George's, like, the Teeny family doesn't have a whole lot of people reporting anything to the police, but George's family is very unimpressed with his involvement with this crime family. So the police were informed, but the cases went to the fraud unit, and the fraud unit basically just kept telling everyone, including Faron, that they didn't have time to look into it, which is like, what is your
fucking
job?
Crazy.
Yeah.
Sorry. We're busy.
Yeah, we can't
don't
look
have
into
time
this.
to preserve justice.
Right. Or like look into this obvious elder abuse or like possible homicides. Like,
right.
what?
This is crazy. We're busy.
Yeah. So when Faron looks into Angela, she discovers that Angela was 24 when she was gifted an individual grant deed from 87-year-old Nicholas Constantine Buford, which turned over half of his property to her. Buford was a Russian-American living in San Francisco at the time, and the document listed Angela as Angela Chiampa, his granddaughter. And then And then 5 months later, in October of 1984, Angela and Nicholas returned to City Hall to amend the document and list Angela as his wife.
Weird. Weird alert.
And then a month after that, Nicholas dies of a heart attack, leaving his young widow $125,000 in assets and a house worth $226,000 in 1993 money, or whenever this is, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Now the medical examiner did think that this timeline was just a little suspicious. And so he conducted an autopsy despite Angela's protestations that she just wanted to move on quickly with this. A tox screen was included, but all that they found were trace levels of mercury and lead and no signs of foul play. And unfortunately, trace levels of mercury and lead in this context are just like, well, that's just life. That's just being a person.
Being a person in that day and age, like...
Yeah. Seeing the obvious pattern here, Faron kept digging and found a joint tenancy agreement between Angela Buford and an 85-year-old widow named Helen M. Mitchell, who died 2 months after the agreement was filed. However, the deal seemingly never came to pass because Mitchell's 2 adult children were listed as the sole heirs of her estate. Faron contacted the daughter, Jocelyn Mitchell Nash, and inquired about the agreement. According to her, she said, "I think a Roma woman tried to steal your mother's house."
You think? My goodness, Miss Faron. I know. I'm the one that caught her.
So apparently, when the elder Mitchell woman's health deteriorated with age and she broke her hip in 1987, she ran into a waitress who offered to take care of her. And that waitress was Angela Buford. Buford moved in with the woman and got her to sign the joint tenancy agreement and leave everything to her in her will. But Jocelyn catches wind of this from a lawyer who drew up the will and thought that everything seemed very fucking suspicious.
Because it is very suspicious.
Yes! Oh my God. I can't even imagine if a family member of mine was like, you know, if I'm checking in and I'm like, how's your hip? And they're like, oh, it's fine. A waitress I met is taking care of me. I'd be like,
who?
What the fuck?
I know.
Yeah. So in this case, rescission papers were drawn up. Angela disappears. And then a few months later, Helen Mitchell dies from gastroenteritis. Now, Faron found Angela was still working at the same deli where she'd met Mitchell, and she began tailing her from a distance. It seemed now that Angela had turned her focus to a new target, 93-year-old Richard Nelson. According to his family, he announced during Thanksgiving 1992 that he was dating the 31-year-old. And his family was shocked, to say the least. Again, this is a Thanksgiving dinner where I'd be like, excuse me, what the fuck?
Yeah, clutches pearls.
And like, you know, it's one thing if people want to engage in like a sugar daddy, sugar baby, whatever type relationship. Whatever they're doing is fine. But whatever Angela was doing to Richard Nelson...
No, it was not above board.
It was not fine.
No.
Faron had seen Angela bringing this man food. And she was concerned for his safety, so she went to the police. She knew the people on the fraud unit, but they were not concerned. And the family told her that this had been going on for months. In return for Angela's generosity, Nelson had been giving her money for things like getting a more reliable car, which turned out to be a pretty expensive BMW. And the family told Faron that they also tried calling the police at some point, but they were told that it's not illegal to be a gold digger.
Oh! Damn. I mean, they got a point. like to a certain degree.
Yeah.
They got a point. But damn.
I know. It's real backhanded to everybody.
I know.
Unfortunately, neither the family nor Faron had any concrete evidence to prove there was anything like a poisoning plot going on. Until mid-October of 1993, when the family of Angela's boyfriend, George's family, decided to come forward with what they knew.
And is he still alive right now?
Richard Nelson?
Yes.
The old man? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. He is currently still alive.
Okay.
So according to the Llama family, they'd overheard Angela and George talking through the walls of their duplex. And also to their faces, they had heard George and Angela had made some throwaway remarks about what they were doing with both Richard Nelson and another man that they were delivering food to. Allegedly, the young lovers discovered a heart stimulant that poisoned victims slowly and was all but undetectable on talk screens of both the living and the dead. George's sister even claimed to have seen him store toxins at the family deli and then sprinkle them on the takeout meals that they were delivering to Nelson and the other man. Yes. So George had a brother named Jerry, and Jerry is a complete character in this book. He's one of the only people that, like, maybe is not depicted well, but he's depicted well enough. Like, he seems just like he stands up for himself, and he's just a hell of a character. According to Jerry, their mother may have been the first guinea pig for the mystery poison of choice, which George referred to as a magic salt.
Oh, my God.
Jerry believed that George poisoned their mother as a dry run in 1991, which caused her to have a heart attack that required surgery. And this was because the mother bought the duplex that Angela earned from her husband's death. So the mother buys it from Angela. Angela gets a bunch of money for it, and then they split it. They live in these split conditions. But Angela would have gotten more money back on her house from the mother dead, and then would have gotten the house back as well. So they think that she tried to kill her.
Double duty.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's cold, to say the least.
Yeah. And I mean, George had to have known about it, right? So
of course he knew. Yeah,
so Jerry's upset. He's very upset. Like, his sister is still living there, and he's just like, you've got to help us whatever way you can. And he does not trust cops. And I love Jerry's character. I love Jerry. He's a person. He's hilarious. But Faron, she hears all this from Jerry, and she's like, why is nobody doing anything? This is ridiculous. She'd been tailing Angela and George for a month. She knew that the two men they'd been taking to were definitely in danger now. And she'd gotten no closer to justice for the late Hope Beasley because Danny Teeny was still the owner of that house.
Right.
So she goes to the fraud unit again and again, and they keep telling her that they're on the case, but there's just no movement as far as she can tell. So she decides to contact Adult Protective Services, who perform a welfare check on Nelson and found him in such poor condition that they were actually worried he wouldn't survive the weekend.
Oh, wow.
From there, the city attorney was contacted, and their investigators finally did something to intervene in the scam and the possible poisoning plot. Investigators performed another welfare check on Nelson and asked him if he knew Angela. They're finally, like, trying to separate these two. And he said that he did, but that she lived with her brother, George, and that
brother? Her brother.
And he said that Angela and Nelson, were going to get married soon, and then the two of them would live together.
Oh.
So it's very clear to them that Nelson is at the very least the victim of financial elder abuse.
Right.
But more than that, one of the cops who was forced to actually start doing their job found the pharmacist who had been supplying this magic salt to George. And the pharmacist denied selling George anything more than Rogaine and penicillin, but then said,
I didn't give George any heart medicine, and if I did, I'm not into anything, you know?
But if I did.
Like,
yeah, you're really...
I'm not a part of this. But you know.
But if I was.
I wasn't a part of it.
And then when interviewed the very next day, this pharmacist tells investigators that he actually checked the store's computer and found that there was actually a 1988 prescription for George's father. So George was the only person to ever pick up the 800 125 milligram pills prescribed over 2 years to Antone Lama because Antone lived in Palestine and needed his son in San Francisco to fill the prescription and then send them to his father because they don't have pharmacies in Palestine.
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
So, a number of sources I referenced to plan for this episode originally referred to this case and all of these events as the Foxglove murders, right? That's what I said up top. And they said that the victims were killed with digitalis. And so when I started researching for this, I assumed that at some point the victims were poisoned with bits of plant matter from the foxglove plant. That is not the case, and I was so irritated when I came to this part of the story and had to reconfigure this episode and this season in my head.
Okay.
So I don't necessarily know that it's super important to be this pedantic, but we covered digoxin when we talked about Charles Cullen, the good nurse, right? And he was poisoning patients with digoxin. And digoxin is a part of digitalis. But this case, these people were murdered with digoxin, not digitalis, not foxgloves. They were just murdered with the same thing Charles Cullen was killing people with.
Oh, okay.
Right? And I'm irritated with this reporting.
That they called it the Foxglove murders.
They called it the Foxglove murders, and they said people were murdered with digitalis. But here's the difference, is that digitalis can either refer to a genus of plants, commonly called foxgloves, or it can refer to a drug preparation of cardiac glycosides, including digoxin, or it can refer to intoxication from those cardiac glycosides. So,
okay.
I was hoping to focus on the combination of digoxin and digitoxin, which is the other thing that you can get from foxgloves and then would be in a natural preparation of digitalis. I was preparing to talk about all of that and like foxglove plants, but unfortunately we're only talking about digoxin. And so I don't know if this is a historical thing where everything was just kind of called digitalis, because it seemed like in the documents I was looking at by 2000, they were starting to distinguish like it was actually digoxin.
Gotcha.
Or if it was just people not understanding what was going on. And to me, it's like the difference between saying somebody was poisoned with opium versus morphine, right?
No, I think that's a really good comparison.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good comparison.
So I guess I'll tell everybody about digitalis and we'll keep going from here. But digitalis...
what's the difference?
Well, the extract, it was first derived in 1785 from the foxglove plant. And the extract contains both cardiac glycosides, which are found in the plant, that digoxin and digitoxin. And although digoxin has a lethal dose of approximately 2 nanograms per mil, digitoxin is closer to 40 nanograms per mil. But put them together and you're going to have like different drug-drug interactions, right?
Sure.
Structurally, they're quite similar, and basically all cardiac glycoside poisonings are kind of indistinguishable from digoxin poisoning. Symptomatically, you're going to have palpitations and things like that. But when you have digitalis and you have both of them, or when you have a digitalis extract, I should say, and you have both of them, that has better oral absorption, a longer elimination half-life, and better hepatic clearance than digoxin alone. And so that would all be relevant to medical workers attempting to get a good read on the type of toxicity that they're dealing with in a patient.
Mm-hmm.
These victims were poisoned with digoxin alone, which was synthetically produced to replicate the compound found in nature. The same thing that Charles Cullen was using. So, yeah, it's not entirely accurate to say they were killed with digitalis, but basically everything I was looking at from pre-2000 was just combining these things together. And
gotcha.
I don't know, it seems...
Yeah, that is misleading.
It's misleading, it's kind of sloppy, I don't know. I was real irritated. So the thing that we can focus on that's slightly different from the Charles Cullen case is that he was killing patients with acute doses. He would come into He'd come into their room, give them a dose.
Give them a bolus, yeah.
Yeah, by morning they'd be dead.
Mm-hmm.
And this is more of a chronic thing, so we can look at that chronic difference. The digoxin that George was using was called lanoxin, which is used pharmaceutically to treat congestive heart failure and atrial fibrillation. And this is because digoxin, when used medicinally, increases sodium and then increases calcium through a cation exchanger, and this makes the heart beat harder and slower. So that, again, if you pump your fist and you try to pump it harder and harder, it's going to be slower every time. An overdose of digoxin acutely, as we talked about before, prevents with vomiting, hyperkalemia, that increased calcium, and a slowed heartbeat. In cases of chronic toxicity, also called digitalis, the toxicity typically presents as renal failure in addition to bradycardia and GI symptoms. And this is actually more common because people kind of get a buildup in their system or they get drug-drug interactions with other things they're on. It's more likely to happen to people who are older and already have some issues going on with their blood, like hypercalcemia, hypokalemia, acidosis, or they have issues with renal clearance, which should all make sense. But there's a lot of drugs that can cause interactions that lead to digitalis, like diuretics, amiodarone, benzos, calcium channel blockers, and some antibiotics. And so it seems very easy if people aren't, again, looking for these drug-drug interactions in their patients, that they'll give them, say an antibiotic and not realize they're on digoxin. Digoxin's therapeutic window is also quite narrow, with an acceptable range between 0.5 nanograms per mil and 0.9 nanograms per mil. It has a therapeutic half-life of 30 to 40 hours normally when not taken to the point of an overdose. And like we said in the Charles Cullen episode, it has interesting toxicokinetics that make the levels in the blood spike immediately and then plateau at 6 hours. So it's kind of hard to get a read on it, and you have to monitor it for a long time. And it's the same thing for a chronic overdose, that if you suspect somebody has a chronic overdose, you really have to monitor the digoxin and calcium levels in their blood for at least a couple hours. If untreated, there's a 50 to 30% chance of mortality within a week of becoming chronically toxic. Yeah. Patients can be treated with IV fluids, and their hyperkalemia and possible kidney symptoms also have to be addressed somewhat separately. In both chronic and acute cases, the antibody antidote digoxin immune fab, or Digibind, can also be given to bind with the digoxin in the body and prevent it from binding to receptors.
And that's if they figure it out soon enough, though?
Yes. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And if they don't go into renal failure, because you could treat the digoxin toxicity and then still end up with the renal failure as a result. So what should be completely unsurprising in this specific case with all of these victims of the teenies and the llamas is that according to the llama women who were questioned, Antone Llama was never even treated for heart problems and would not have needed a prescription for Lanoxin, as his son claimed. Jerry told the investigators that George and Antone hadn't even been on speaking terms for a couple of years, and he provided a tape recording of a conversation with his father. So Jerry calls his dad, and he's like, hey, this is what's going on. And his dad proved, in this conversation that he'd never received the prescriptions or any package from George.
Yeah.
And he had no idea what his son would have been doing with these.
Murdering people.
Yeah. Richard Nelson's nephew took it upon himself to request a blood test for his uncle, who was still alive, to test for digoxin, and it came back as present in his blood, but at a non-lethal level. But this was still concerning because Nelson wasn't on digoxin.
Right. Like, where the fuck did this come from?
Right. It's not naturally occurring in the body. So everybody's like, hey, this is weird. And we think we know where it's coming from. So the police stage an intervention with Nelson to kind of break him and Angela up and tell him, like, hey, she's a danger to you. And the people...
Finally, they're doing something.
Kind of.
Oh, no.
It's gonna be right. It's so disappointing how long this takes to resolve. But the people at this intervention included the chief medical examiner and Nelson's cardiologist.
Okay.
Like, can you imagine walking into an intervention and, like, your fucking doctor's there and the coroner's there and you're like, what the fuck is going on?
What is happening right now? Am I dead?
Right.
Am I dead?
And then they're like, you need to break up with your boyfriend. And you're like, excuse me?
Yeah. So weird.
But when they arrived, Angela was at Nelson's house.
No.
So they kind of had a change of plans. They were like, all right, this intervention obviously isn't going to work. Nelson was not happy. He said that there was no way Angela could have poisoned him because she never cooked for him or brought him food. And when Faron hears about this, she's like, she brings him food every day.
Every day.
What are you talking about? So police interview Angela, and they told her that they knew what her game was, but then they just let her go.
Ugh.
So Faron keeps digging because she wants to get this case closed before anyone else dies. She's very worried about Richard Nelson and this other man.
And I mean, and rightly so. Like,
Yes.
he's being poisoned.
And no one's doing anything.
And no one's doing anything about it except for the intervention, like this foiled intervention. Like, what?
So she continues to work with Jerry, and she gets one of the lawman nephews named Roland to confess to a slew of crimes committed at George's behest. Like, he's working with his uncle because his uncle's so cool. And some of these crimes include poisoning 91-year-old Stephen Sorvik in 1992. And this was a little bit different than the others. So after George and Angela came into Storvik's good graces and were benefiting financially from his misplaced trust, they began sprinkling halcyon into his food so that they could break into his apartment to have sex there and steal his things.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So halcyon is a benzodiazepine sleeping pill, which was first made available in the U.S. in 1982 and is known generically as triazolam. Safety concerns regarding errors in clinical studies that first overlooked issues with depression, amnesia, and hallucinations in connection with the drug led it to be recalled from the market in several countries between 1991 and 1997. But not the U.S.
USA, A-OK.
Instead, we opted to relabel the drug to alter the dosage and warn about the side effects, because of course we did.
That sounds pretty typical.
Yeah, but of course, if you're trying to force someone to sleep so you can steal their money, you don't really give a shit about any of that. An overdose of halcyon can occur at doses around 2 milligrams, which is 4 times the max therapeutic dose. But the effects of the drug impact the elderly at lower doses than other people. Toxicity presents with intense drowsiness, confusion, slurred speech, seizures, coma, and possibly eventual death. Luckily, Storvik did not get to that point. He realized, to at least some degree, what was going on and accused Angela of overdosing him on sleeping pills after he woke up paralyzed on one occasion.
Oh, no.
And couldn't get himself to fully wake up, which can relate to wouldn't want that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
He had made Angela sole heir in his will at this point. But when he became suspicious of her and George, he wrote her out of it again. And then he moved without telling either of them, but they tracked him down.
Oh.
Yeah, they really, really wanted to get at this guy's money. This time, they poisoned him with digoxin, like a large dose of digoxin. But he lived through this bolus, this poisoning, moved again, and he did get to die of natural causes like 2 years later.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, somewhat of a happy ending.
Yeah.
Hiding in all of it. He got away.
But he still was poisoned on multiple occasions.
Well, poisoned on multiple occasions, had to move around, spend his golden years, fighting for his life.
Yeah. Poor guy. In early 1994, Angela lawyered up once all these accusations start coming at her about Richard Nelson and everything. And her lawyer started digging through Richard Nelson's medical history to look for a digitalis prescription to prove that digoxin should be present in his blood and that Angela wasn't slipping anyone anything nefariously. But it's not like she really needed much representation because the fire had completely gone out from under the investigators, that Faron had gotten interested, and the DA was put on the case, but was kind of slacking on their job and just no one gave a shit anymore. So Faron now is just like, you know what? Fine. I'm going to the press.
Okay.
Specifically, she contacted Dan Reed from the San Francisco Chronicle. She knew that he could publish a thorough, well-investigated story, but that meant it wouldn't hit stands anytime soon. And unfortunately, they weren't able to break the story before Angela and George claimed another victim. Harry Glover Hughes was getting worked by Angela and George at the same time as Richard Nelson. But where Nelson's family was able to intervene and get him put in a retirement home away from Angela and George, Hughes was not so lucky. Despite the fact that Faron and his neighbors and caseworkers were brought on to bring the elder abuse he was experiencing to light, but he didn't have family members who could continue to push for him. He died of a stroke on March 30th, 1994, aged 94, and his entire $1.2 million estate went to relatives because Hughes never wrote Angela or George into his will or his estate, but they did manage to drain him of plenty of his money during his final years. Like, when bank statements were reviewed, they were just taking huge sums of money and then coming in and being like, hey, can I have $50? Like, they were taking as much as they could.
Damn.
So luckily they weren't able to...
At least they didn't get all of it. But still.
And it just sucks that, like, the relatives that it went to, like, couldn't push harder or get more done. I don't know. But Hughes's death renewed interest in the case that, you know, it never really went cold, but people kind of lost interest. And people lost interest, it seemed, because it was just like, they're gonna die soon anyhow, was kind of the sentiment. Like, they're all old and they're gonna die soon.
That's so fucked up.
I know. It's like, okay, so they don't get to deserve the last couple of years of their life to be enjoyable? But now homicide's involved because they suspect poisoning.
Right.
And exhumations of past suspected victims were ordered. So they do a tox screen on Hughes's body. And then the first person they disinterred was Angela's late husband, Nicholas Buford, who they exhumed on March 28th. Many of the people they exhumed, despite leaving behind large estates, were buried in paupers' graves with cheap caskets that did nothing to preserve the corpses. In all, 4 bodies were exhumed and tested, including Philip Steiner, Stephen Storvik, and Konstantin Litvetsyn. All 4 tested positive for digitalis, or digoxin, the mere presence of which was all that was needed to prove a crime, even in decomposed or embalmed remains, because, again, there was no way that this would be produced as part of, like, the body's natural processes, right, or the decay process.
And it's not, and so earlier on, it wasn't that they couldn't test for it, it's just that they didn't test for it because they didn't know what they were looking for.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So now everything is ramping up.
Mm-hmm.
Retesting has to be conducted because they want it to be verified through, like, multiple laboratories. And it could just take months to do this retesting. The expose from Reed is almost ready, and then George Lama gets arrested for an armed domestic disturbance and making terrorist threats at his family. However, he was not held on any charges and remained a free man who continued to threaten his mother, his brother Jerry. He was just a menace while he was out and about.
Yeah, it was a different time.
Reed's article was finally published on June 18th in the Oakland Tribune and was a scathing indictment of the incompetence of the SFPD, which was not unwarranted. Like,
no, they deserved every bit of it, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, and there's just so much that, like, Jack Olson does describe in the book going on with the fraud unit, where, like, there was one main guy on the fraud unit who Faron knew, and she kept pushing him, and then he gets a partner, and she's like, oh, good, you're gonna have, like, more hands on deck.
Yeah.
But he got a partner because that guy had shot and killed somebody in the line of duty and was facing, like, a legal battle for it. And she was like, man, this is the worst person you can have.
God damn it.
Yeah, so there were shenanigans going on. There were 3 installments of Reed's articles, and his 3rd installment was released in July. And even by then, no arrests had been made on the case. And it seemed to send this message that this is how you scam old people. This is how you kill them and get away with it. And... you know, likely no one's going to intervene because this is how little the cops care about it.
Right. And then life goes on.
Yeah.
Like...
So James Vlasto reads these articles, and it makes him connect the dots on something. In October of 1993, New York City PR rep James Vlasto and his family knew something was wrong with his Uncle Andrew. No one had heard from him in a while, and so James, even though they weren't on great terms, he went over to visit his uncle and just kind of check on him. When he got there, neighbors said that they hadn't seen or heard from Andrew in days. And so James ordered a welfare check from the police, which revealed a poorly kept apartment, but no Andrew. And since there was no Andrew, they figured everything was fine, and they forced James to leave.
That he was just there. He just wasn't there.
He's just not there. And so they forced James to leave without him investigating anything.
Okay.
So Andrew's phone was either always busy when they called, or it rang and rang and rang and went to voicemail. And so James wasn't able to contact him after the visit. And when he finally does, an in-home nurse answers, who tells him that Andrew broke his hip in a fall and wasn't feeling well. Days later, James tried to visit again just to put eyes on the old man, and was greeted with a message pinned to Andrew's front door saying that Andrew was in the hospital.
Oh.
But even when he gets to the hospital, he's not allowed to see Andrew because he was told that only the closest living relative could visit. And James is like, Andrew doesn't have kids. I'm his nephew. I'm literally his closest living relative.
Yeah, it's me. You're looking for me.
And the hospital staff correct him, saying, no, his wife is present. 28-year-old Sylvia Vlasto, who James had never heard of in his life.
Right.
So James starts digging into Andrew's finances and found that roughly $80,000 was lost. He retained a lawyer and got temporary guardianship over his uncle, but Sylvia was still legally married and had conjugal rights at the hospital.
What? Because that's where sexy time needs to happen?
The hospital?
Is in the hospital
Where
after you broke your hip? Okay, girl.
So she exercises her rights, visits overnight, and the next day Andrew's worse. Shocking. Blood tox came back positive for digoxin, phenobarbital, some sort of benzodiazepine, codeine, and opiates, which had not been administered by the hospital.
That's quite the cocktail.
Yes. He died before noon the next morning because of this cocktail. And with no will in place, Andrew's $500,000 plus estate and assets all went to Sylvia.
Damn.
It was 82 days from the signing of his marriage license to the signing of his death certificate. After doing some digging, James realizes that Sylvia hadn't exactly worked alone, and she was part of the teeny bimbo family, which was the connection that he made when he read Dan Reed's article. And so this is what gets him to contact the rat dog Dick and say, hey, this is now a coast-to-coast thing we're looking at. On January 6, 1995, the San Francisco Examiner published an article linking the Vlasto case to those in San Francisco, and that night, 2020 ran an episode about the poisonings, and still, the police did nothing.
I know that I should not be surprised at this point, but it's kind of infuriating.
Yeah.
Like, everybody's doing their jobs for them.
I know. Yeah. Literally everybody.
Everybody but them are like, hey, guys, there's this thing going on.
Yeah.
I want attention.
Now it's what? Because the attention is on them, it's like they're getting worse and childish.
Yeah.
Because now the fraud unit is very honestly telling people they didn't want to work on any case that Faron might be involved in.
What?
Yes, and this included not just the new elder abuse cases popping up around San Francisco that may or may not have been related to the teeny bimbo clan, but were just like, hey, that's a way you can do this. But they also didn't want to get involved in scams involved marrying AIDS patients and collecting on their insurance when they died.
Okay.
Richard Nelson unfortunately died around Thanksgiving of 1995 and remained in contact with Angela until his death, if only through the receptionists at his care facility. The statute of limitations for fraud allegations in some of the cases were set to run out in early to mid-1997, and this may be the only reason that a grand jury finally convened in July of 1997. 112 witnesses testified on the 4 related cases, and on November 6, 1997, the jury returned a sealed 96-count indictment. This charged Mary Steiner with 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and her sons received charges for stealing from a dependent adult. George Lama and Angela Buford each received 6 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. Danny Teeny received 9 counts of stealing from a dependent and 1 count of grand theft, and they all received lesser charges as well. In all, it's estimated that they stole some $1.9 million from their victims, or roughly $2.9 million today.
Damn.
And still, proceedings continued to drag on. A year after the indictments, the DA still hadn't brought the case to trial. A Superior Court judge was so unimpressed by this timeline that he threatened to fine prosecutors $500 a day if they didn't pick up the pace.
Like, snap to it.
Yeah.
To it, y'all. Yeah.
Like,
this has been going on an ungodly amount of time. Like,
yes.
It's about time.
Yeah.
It's something.
Meanwhile, the defense was arguing that too much evidence was missing and the case should be dismissed entirely. And in fact, charges were dismissed against Mary for lack of evidence, and the charges against her son Teddy were completely dropped because the statute of limitations expired.
Ugh.
George's nephew Roland was charged with 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder for assisting his uncle, but pled guilty and was freed in exchange for testimony against Angela and George. Instead of sticking around to give that testimony, Roland fled. All of this stalling ended when the case itself abruptly ended in February of 2000, when Angela and George pled guilty to their fraud charges. Originally, the two faced 25 years to life, but their guilty plea made it so that Angela only served 4 years, including time served, and was out in 6 months.
What?
Yes. Yes.
No way.
Yeah, well, they didn't get them for poisoning or murder. It was all fraud
right,
stuff.
Just the fraud.
Yeah.
Damn.
George, meanwhile, got 8 years with time served and was out by 2004 when the charges against the remaining 6 defendants in the San Francisco case, including Danny Taney, were dropped for problems with witnesses, evidence, and previous court decisions.
Damn.
As far as the New York case, Sylvia Mitchell faced a Manhattan court in July of 2000 and was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison for the manslaughter death of Andrew Vlasto, grand larceny, and perjury. She served 10 years and was released on parole in 2009.
Wow. That's crazy.
In terms of what everybody else was up to, in 1997, Faye Rat Dog Dick Faron co-founded the Elder Angels, a nonprofit which helps victims of elder abuse. She also successfully lobbied the California state legislature to make elder abuse a felony rather than a misdemeanor.
Okay, well, that's very cool.
She is a pretty cool person. Like, she did really push for this case and was working on it for, 8 years or something like that?
Yeah.
And like pro bono too. Like, she was not making anything off of this. So
and it sounded like it took a lot of time.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, because she was tailing people and researching documents and I think the overall lesson here is check in on your elders.
Absolutely.
They are an at-risk group that if we're lucky, we will have to join one day, and they need to be taken care of in a way to respect their autonomy and acknowledge, the disabilities and disadvantages that come with age and can be exploited by people.
Absolutely. I mean, they're very vulnerable and very susceptible to this type of thing. That's great.
And I mean, there are jokes about like boomers and things like that who don't know about stranger danger and media literacy and can get drawn into financial scams and stuff. And it's like, you gotta, even if it's frustrating and even if you're like, wow, raising my mom's really hard, like, you have to check in on these people and make sure that, like,
it's important.
Yeah. So
all great advice.
Yeah.
All great advice.
So that's all I've got. What do you think?
I think this was an extremely sad one.
Yeah.
These poor people who are just trying to live out the rest of their years, and then they think they found love and they're getting absolutely had. It's tragic.
I know.
Absolutely tragic.
Yeah.
It's like Bass Ackwards from Knives Out.
Knives Out, yeah.
It's like the Bass Ackwards version. Like, he actually got a nurse who cared, but like, and left all of the money to them in the will. But like, no, not these. Don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah, sometimes it's good to investigate what's going on there if you're not being racist about it, because
Well, yeah.
they were being racist against Marta. And don't be racist if you do have a Roma nurse either. Like, that's a possibility.
No, but like that's absolutely tragic that they had to go through all of this and then just to be poisoned and like
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, check on your family, check on your loved ones.
Yeah. Yeah. Check in on your folks. Check
And
in on the
it's
people you care about.
misleading.
It was misleading. I was so
It's
upset.
misleading.
I was like, okay, how do I have to look at this now?
Yeah.
It's Digoxin Part 2, which it wasn't supposed to be.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus Daneko. Stay safe, and remember,
The dose makes the poison.